Okay, it looks like things are going well. Folks are coming in. I'll continue to admit them when their names pop up. I would like to acknowledge those who have from time immemorial lived on and cared for the land on which I find myself. I express my gratitude and honor the Indigenous people who have lived and worked on and cared for this land. I've learned this is land inhabited by the Mohawk, the Anishinaabe, and Algonquin, and was specifically the subject of the Crawford Purchase dated 1783. My name is Dean Black, and I'm the Professional Development Director with the Pavro Board. And it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker with just a few comments as we continue to welcome everybody in. This looks like it's going to be a well-attended event, and I'm so grateful for all of your professional interests. As professionals and aspiring professionals to and in the volunteer resource leadership and management sector, we have every reason to ponder the state of the sector. Understanding what is going on is a key part of the process by which we seek to make things better for volunteers, for those who lead volunteers, and for those who manage nonprofits, charities, and other entities which depend on volunteers. The Charity Insights Canada Project State of the Canadian Charitable Sector Mid-Year Report for 2023 popped up in my emails this morning, and it sheds light on certain dynamics, one or more of which are likely to come up in our speaker's presentation today. I make reference to the report because it projects a good deal of evidence bolstering the assertions I make regarding how important it is for us to do what it is we are about to do, that is, seek from our most professional and our best the knowledge we need in an evolving world. I give you one exemplar here, Mr. Adam James. Adam is a CVA. He is a passionate not-for-profit leader with a heart for advocacy, volunteerism, and community building. He is the coordinator of volunteer resources at the Ottawa Food Bank, the vice president of Volunteer Management Professionals of Canada, and co-chair of Ottawa Leaders of Volunteers. Adam has been published in Engage Journal and with the CCVA, Volunteer Canada, VMPC, Volunteer Ottawa, and Beyond the Bake Sale, and works with dozens of organizations on their volunteer management practices. He lives in Ottawa with his wife and 3 teens. In his version of the bio, I think he said his amazing wife and wonderful teens, but I had to remove those because it's much more appropriate for you, Adam, to make those emphases. Thank you so much, Adam, for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Dean. And again, welcome everybody. It's really exciting to be sharing on this topic. And yeah, I think in my bio, I mentioned that every time I say that I have 3 teenagers, my heart palpitates a bit and I get a little dizzy in the head, but all good. They are awesome human beings and I very much love doing life with them. And it's exciting to adventure into parenting teens because it's a whole new ball game. Playing Legos and doing little things like that. That's one level, but seeing young little adults all around our lives is another piece. But looking into today, I do want to preface and share a few things that this is a really different workshop than I have typically done, and I'm excited and also coming to it with a lot of humility. I want to thank Dean for inviting me and suggesting some topics. And one of them was the essence of volunteering. And we kind of said that topic itself is even larger than what I'm covering today, which is more like a history of volunteering and volunteer leadership. And very much just a scraping off the top of the surface to kind of hit some key topics on the topic. So what I want to share today is that hopefully this can start a journey or a bit of a conversation about recapturing some of our history. I promised I wouldn't talk much about COVID today, but I think it's distracted us from the journey that we might have been on ahead of time, or it might also be recalibrating us. And now, and I've been sharing with people I'm talking to, it feels like we're finally catching our breath a bit and looking ahead and thinking about the future a little bit more than just recovering from what we've been through the past few years. And it's an exciting time, but it's also a time to say, if you don't remember the past, there's a famous saying that you're you're kind of putting yourself at risk of not learning from the mistakes of the past and remembering all the important things that have happened. So with that, we want to take a bit of time to retrospect. I will share that I usually make my presentations very interactive and very kind of participant focused. Being this is a bit of a history review, it's hard to do that. So I will try to keep it engaging as possible. Please, if you have content to contribute, the chat is available, connect through that. But I will be racing through a large amount of material in a relatively short amount of time. And I do want to get to kind of that moment of what does this history have to do with us today? I will note I'm not a historian. I wish there were more historians in the volunteer management world that we could help utilize and capture and codify some of our history. There are some great resources that I do have available in the slideshow and I will be referring to. But I am very interested in our past and I'm very curious as a human being. So as I walk into this sharing with you, it is very much out of curiosity and a discovering, just as hopefully you'll discover some things you maybe haven't experienced. It's a chance to learn a little bit more about our collective professionalism and together. So it's with that I bring us volunteerism, a retrospect. And just that, as I wanted to look back and survey a past course of events and a period of time. And with that is this idea of volunteerism. This picture inspired me because there's a lot going on in it. You can see very much, through it, and several layers of history. And this picture could tell a story about, various things that have happened in this particular area over time. So as you see that picture, reflect on that, history has many layers as we continue through. We're going to explore a bit. I always like to tell people what I'm going to go through before we go through it, keep me accountable and keep me on the straight and narrow of what we're going to share. So with that, we're going to talk about some key moments in history of volunteering and global perspectives, some early visions of volunteerism, and with that, leaders of volunteers. This idea that volunteer leadership born out of volunteerism and how that's going to transform through what has been traditionally, and especially in the North American perspective, a hierarchical society, to what we can only hope is a more collaborative, from a colonial past to a post-colonial future. And in that, how is our role evolving? Maybe we're not going to be doing the same things and tackling the same challenges that we have in the past. And how is our role key, or is it relevant to decentralizing power in communities? And then that future look, we won't probably get too far into this, but it's a really great thinking point is, as we're progressing along this historical timeline, how do we rally and add volunteerism to continue to be a force for good and moving into the future? So that's what we're hoping to cover. We might get to point 3 and run at a time, but this is an ongoing conversation, and I hope that we can continue to join as we go. So we do start as far back on the timeline as we can. Our human history, when we talk about it, volunteering is just a thin, especially formal, organizational-based volunteering is such a small part of the whole picture. When we look at volunteering and the modernization of society, we can look back to our humanity and our shared humanity. Organized society has had a lot of controversy, and we're understanding our past, things that we now, are really aboard to, things like forced labor and slavery, things like consolidated power. When you think of, the ages that we have passed, where you have castles with a ruler who consolidated as much wealth to themselves and used humans to make sure that their power was, carried forward and through history. And often those people were the ones who told the stories and were able to keep the history. And so to now look at society, we see a different picture, and we are able to look at how power dynamics work in a much different way. But as we look back, we can also see that ever since humanity organized into society, there have been moments of care, of progress, of helping each other. And that's so important to note, that over the past hundreds of thousands of years, informal volunteering or or doing good in our communities has been part of humanity. And it's only been in very small parts in the past 10,000 years or so, and even more specifically in our modern era, only decades, that formal volunteering has been an organized, trackable, like documentable force in our society. And so when people talk about the trend to informal volunteering, I even see that as just a reverting back to our human nature and how we care for people in our communities in so many ways. One really great kind of conversation about society and helping and caring is Margaret Mead, an anthropologist who famously was asked, what do you look for when you trying to understand when civilizations begin? Is there a certain type of clothing or certain like archaeological finds? And she said famously, it's a healed femur, because a person in a society who was not able to hunt, to gather, to get the things that they need because they were injured, had the society around them to allow them to heal and to get better, is a really great sign that there was a collective helping and a collective system of caring for each other. Margaret Mead is also a great profile because one of her quotes is very infamous in volunteer management, is that to never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. And indeed, that's the only thing that never has. So you may have seen that somewhere around, and it's the same. Just thought that was interesting as a character in gauging anthropologically in society, also came to this conclusion with this quote that really carries heavily into volunteer engagement. As we look at the informal setting, we look back to where has humanity gone over many, many years. And informal volunteering happens in all societies, family bonds, social clubs, and also in all the world's religions. And when you look at the world's religions, if you've ever looked around and heard this, that each one of them has a tenet about this idea of a golden rule, or caring for others as you care for yourself. And that's really incredible to look back at history and see a lot of caring that comes through how societies have adapted. With close fit families and close-knit communities, there's a regular integration of care that has extended into the community and greater world. When we look at the First Nations values that we experiencing, and many of us have taken the time to learn more about, we see much of what we had hoped to see in progressive values already emulated in the values they were already practicing before Western society even was involved. So things like society operating in a state of relatedness is one of the key core values, or the idea that you find your value in feeling comfortable measured on the quality of your relationships, not on your financial status or on how much money you have in your retirement account. And then we have this idea that when is this ability to give to others available? And we talk about, as society has moved forward, this idea that the ability to help others is actually comes out of a stable and an able society and thriving communities. So one thing I like to say and relate to people is that maybe volunteering is the evidence of a healthy and free society. And I want to balance those two conversations before we get into volunteering in organized and formal terms, though. If you had a high freedom and low moral society, you would see people struggling to take time to care for each other because they're so free, but they can focus on themselves. In a place where you have a high moral but low freedom society, you'll have people who struggle to gain access to care for others, and the care would be continually based on those who are in power. And in different places and spaces, you might see this imbalance of places that may have high freedom but low morals, or high morals and low freedom. And we're hoping that both of those could be present. And in that, people will lean in to use their freedom to do the good for those that are around them. And so it's a very interesting kind of balancing act that we have to look at as throughout history. So the big transition into that is, let's look a little bit more into formal volunteering and how that came along. So one interesting kind of place and space that formal volunteering came into place was in the 1700s, in the first volunteer firefighters. And both in the States and Canada, volunteer firefighters have been a long-standing life-saving presence in communities. And so to look at that volunteering has happened and have been in place, almost by necessity has to be formal, because you can't just casually be a volunteer firefighter prepared if you don't know when you're going to be engaging that. And it takes some organization. Some other interesting pieces that come along, the 1800s is really when we see organizations that utilize volunteerism as a major part of what they exist as. So if you look at the YMCA or the American Red Cross or the United Way, it was in the 1800s that these organizations began their work. So it's very new, a creation of how organizational societies are able to begin this idea of formal volunteering and signing up and saying, I'm a member of the YMCA and I give my time as a formal part of belonging to a community that way. And it's only in the 1900s that mainstream volunteerism really began to flourish, and what we understand as volunteerism today really began to shape as the not-for-profit became a solidified structure into society. And what we're looking at today is really quite interesting. And it's only in 1919 that the first volunteer center opened in the United States, and in 1937 in Montreal was the first Canadian volunteer center. So, you know, give or take 100 years ago, that volunteering became so official that there would be a place and a space for people to come and to explore their volunteering engagements. We're going to look in through the 1900s a little bit, and one person that came out and the quote that stood out is that J. Edgar Hoover had a statement to saying that volunteering was one of the only effective tools they had during the Great Depression to offset poverty and to help and encourage those in the community to rally together to actually be able to combat the incredible negative financial circumstances that people found themselves in. One other part of formal volunteering that became abundantly clear and important was in the World War. So, and we think about, it's been over 100 years since the First World War, but the efforts during that time were anchored in volunteerism on all fronts, from people volunteering their time, volunteering their lives, volunteering, and it became a whole societal volunteer effort. Post-war, volunteering changed, and it became more about how do we help various parts of society in different eras. I found this interesting as I was looking at the different eras we walked through. The 20s was very much about these social societies, about boys and girls clubs, about having access to building up yourself in society. If we know the Roaring 20s, it was a time where things might have been a little bit more affluent. So the types of volunteering opportunities that began were reflective of this, what the society was going through. And then in the Great Depression, it adapted and changed. So there were different volunteering opportunities. People started consolidated resources and places and spaces where people could come and access resources, and having volunteers run as part of that. And then again, in World War II, society revamped into that. The next part is just a snippet about Canada during the wartime. And it really does. And one of the resources, again, like I said, there's lots of different source materials for this, really examines that volunteering is sometimes an underrated part of how societies get through their most difficult times. And for Canadians, the volunteering that happened during the World War was whole society. Everybody was encouraged and invited and stepped up to make everything possible happen during those times. So again, walking through this, in the last number of years, we had the post-war era, and some really incredible stories happened out of this, because we were all of a sudden in an era where the advancements that have happened technologically and especially in medicine gave a lot of hope to people, and it was at a boom era for medical societies. And so we think of things like multiple sclerosis, the Arthritis Society, Diabetes Association. These were all post-war organizations and really began to coalesce in that era, which again, as new needs present and new opportunities to enhance or support society were present, volunteering opportunities were also present in those times. And another great example, and really powerful example of an organization that coalesced after the war in the 40s and 50s was Elizabeth Fry. And just an example, in both British Columbia and Ontario, this organization came to help women in conflict with the law, as well as supporting women in a variety of other aspects that had not yet been a regular, sustained, volunteer engaged effort. And that, again, looking at our short timeline, was not ancient history. And that's something that we're still learning to create equity today. In the 60s and 70s, activism was a huge part, and volunteerism became aligned. And if you even study the word advocate, it was in the 60s and 70s that was a really common word in our society. And over the 80s, 90s, it dipped down. And interestingly enough, looking into it, is that over the past 5 years, that word advocacy, which is definitely a form of volunteering, has started to come up as common use in society again. And with great need, as we're seeing that we're once again tackling these societal issues that need to be addressed to allow more people to have equal presence in our societies. Another really interesting point for us is this is when many AVAs began, and associations of volunteer managers, and we'll get more into those specific details in the next part of the presentation. In 1980, a few really large-scale volunteer engagement things had happened. The first one was that activism for First Nations here in Canada began to become prevalent and front of mind. And then beyond that, it was also a time when government support for the general not-for-profit began to decline. And you see organizations begin to pop up that were community-based, community-supported, and community-run. This is organizations like food banks, like centers for people who are homeless, experiencing homelessness, drop-in centers, or telephone hotlines, accessible counseling and support. Really an era where the greater community began to compensate for where the government had previously been investing a lot of money, but was no longer supporting at a great scale. And if that theme seems familiar, a lot of our not-for-profits are experiencing a very similar presence today. And then from the 90s today, the modern era, we just are experiencing extreme growth and change. And that's a theme that really is coming into full steam when we talk about how do we deal with change management. It feels like we've gone into this level of change that we're no longer hiking, but we're actually mountain climbing. The change is happening so fast. We're more in a vertical growth than we are in a horizontal. Again, in the past 50, 60 years, one of the most important and presence of change in volunteering has happened in advocacy. And Martin Luther King, obviously, both presence in the States where they celebrate his day, even to this day, with acts of service in the community. One of the amazing things, and you can get many more resources that I could give justice today, but somebody who based their life on this ideal that what are you doing for others? And both in what we talked about throughout the early human history in this presentation of that caring for community, but in our days that we have today in a more formal, organized society, what are we able to do for others is an important question that we come across as volunteer managers, and an inspiration to move forward into what's next. So as we kind of look more specifically and lean in, I went through a bunch of archival information. It really seems that 1983 was the high watermark for visibility for volunteerism across both Canada and the United States. But in 1983, there was actually issued a volunteerism national stamp, which was quite powerful to think that all across the world that volunteerism was being, and they use stamps way more than they do now, but that volunteerism made it such an important impact that it was being put on the corner of envelopes, and that reminder to volunteer and lend a hand was an interesting find. And believe it or not, a little lighthearted piece, but there was a board game. Volunteerism was a board game in 1983, and I don't know if anybody's seen an actual copy of this or has access to it, but I'm really hoping maybe one turns up sometime and we could take a look. But it's just a fun evidence, the cultural evidence that volunteerism in 1983 was something that was right up there and making significant inputs in the society. When we switch and focus now more on volunteer management, I thought this was great, and you're going to see some things that are, maybe things that are coming up in topics today, but I like going back, and I was awesome. I like a visual. So the mentality that volunteer managers wears many hats is definitely not a new idea, because in 1965, this was a visual illustration of volunteer managers. And it's really great to kind of see that that's been a truth about our field for, going on. I think, let me do some math here, but 55, 60 years. So, and if anybody's thinking, this would make a great volunteer management, maybe t-shirt or tattoo or something, could really own the historical value of that. But looking through our history a bit more specifically in volunteer management, 1965, there was a forum on volunteering and the workshops that started to begin. And one of the workshop topics that were discussed, the ethics around paying or not paying volunteers in various circumstances, confusion over terminology between volunteerism, and volunteerism, which we continue to work with our language today on how we clearly define what we do. 1969, there are long form data about volunteering and volunteering statistics. So we talk about data today and it being a really important part of understanding our ecosystem and what's going on in the trend lines. And I'm just glad we're not doing it by hand, according to this archival that could be quite arduous to tally all the data that was done in 1969. And a very exciting find, and something that CCVA might be well aware of or not, but I found the origins of volunteer engagement in 1979. A case was made for the professionalization of volunteer management and the documentation for the origins of our CVA designation. So that's pretty exciting that in 1979 was the published framework and beginnings of that. And again, doing some math, that's about 50 some years now, and really exciting that today, and maybe if they could see us today and how the CVA has evolved, they'd be really excited to see people across the world now following some of that early work that was done in the late 70s. In 1979, another really great article I was able to dig up in volunteer management is that people have been debating about the ethics of volunteering and leading volunteers into ethical decisions. You don't have to squint and try to read this, but that people were working on these highly, difficult conversations about, well, if somebody wants to volunteer, should we let them? What if they're not an appropriate person for that position and they end up causing more harm in their volunteering than good? Are you actually making a case that the person not volunteering is more helpful than them volunteering? And so this is interesting to find this article debating an ethical conversation that we continue to have to this day. This was another great one, a document from 1978 talking about the value and the impact of a successful volunteer coordinator and their successful volunteer program, and how it gains value for all different facets and parts of the organization. So again, understanding our impact as professionals goes back as far as the late 70s to understand that when you have somebody who's invested the time to become a professional leader of volunteers and has developed that strong program, that there are countless and abilities. And it's a really interesting graphic to resonate with as you are reflecting on the value of your program and how to advocate within that perspective. I couldn't do justice to this presentation without spending some time talking about Susan Ellis, who passed away just over 5 years ago now. If you're on LinkedIn or other social medias, you probably have seen some honorariums and reflections on her passing, but I can't do justice to it in a short time. But Susan Ellis was one of the pioneering professionals who went above and beyond to create space and place and advocacy. She authored or co-authored 14 books on volunteer management, was a huge leader in the sector for many, many years, and was definitely an advocate and someone who I unfortunately didn't have the pleasure of meeting, but I've met many people who said that she left a lifelong lasting impression on them, and have guided and been a passionate part of their journey as leaders of volunteers. And just one of those quotes that is very Susan Ellis, as I've heard from other people, is that that commenting on someone else's volunteer work and activism, and kind of sharing that view of only no one gets paid to rebel, and that and sometimes in volunteering that you can make that revolutionary impact. And so it's a very empowering human and person and a legacy. One of the resources that I share from regularly is the Susan Ellis Archives, and a lot of Susan's work, as well as other work collected throughout, is present in her archives. And one that I've gone back to a number of times now that never ceases to have more and more useful information to be excited and passionate about. Our profession and the history of our profession and the richness continued to grow and develop. In 1981, the Journal of Volunteer Administration was published in the United States. As well, in 1981, the first National Canadian Network of Volunteer Managers hosted its first meeting. In 1982, the Journal and the Ontario AVA posted its first journal, and then later that organization reformed to become the Pavro that we know today. And in 1989, a lot of the correspondence and development of our profession was done via mail-in articles. And one timestamp that I was pleased in preparation for this workshop, I reached out to Rob Jackson for some archival information, and found a young, spry Rob Jackson was writing across the pond and commenting on various volunteer management things all the way back to 1989, which is a fun stake in the volunteer management. One I always talk about, like, wow, like to be in the field back in the various points. In 1995, I was excited and kind of impressed to see that volunteer managers are working towards having outcome-based evidence evaluation models. And they did this presentation as well on satellite broadcasted television. So it's not anything I had heard that had happened in the past, but some forward-thinking individuals in the 90s were able to stream via television a very dynamic and topic that we talk about regularly today. How do we use outcome-based evaluation methods to show our volunteer impact? So interesting to see that some of the work that we're doing today was being done in various forms, even 20 to 30 years ago. And then coming into the 2000s, our legacy and our history continues to build. And I found this actually not through being Canadian, but I found this through the Susan Ellis Archives, that in 2001, the Canadian government struck an accord with the voluntary sector. And you can actually read the document of the government and the voluntary sector creating a partnership for investment. Unfortunately, we are now 23 years past this and have not renewed or revisited this from a government perspective. In 2001, there was also the Year of the Volunteer. And one of the things that sparked me is that the 20th anniversary of the Year of the Volunteer, there was a very low kind of just a couple of social media posts about it. But I am excited to see in 2026, the UN has declared 2026 an International Year of the Volunteer, and waiting to see what that means for the volunteer sector and volunteer engagement. We look towards the modernization of volunteer management. We look at 2009, and the former Volunteer Managers Association rebrands as Alive in the States. In 2011, the European Year of Volunteering and policy agenda for volunteering in Europe takes place. And you can continue to see that we're working towards always impacting and re-establishing and engaging and figuring out what does volunteering and volunteer management mean to us in the future. Into this year, into last year, Volunteer Canada began their newest national action strategy. And I suggest if you haven't read that yet and been involved, it's available on their website to get caught up on their process of how they're going to create the next national campaign or national action strategy for Canadian volunteering across the country. So that's a whirlwind. I know it was a thin slice of everything that could happen, but it does show a number of really impactful pieces to our history, to volunteering, to the short glimpse and blip that organized organized formal volunteering has in the big picture. But I hope it puts you at a place to say there's so much to discover, there's so much to learn, to gain from these early efforts and how they matched what was going on in society, and how volunteering was often birthed out of global needs and global type challenges, and what people were understanding of the time. We take that and we bring it to this idea of where now you can only ever act in the present. You can learn from the past, you can plan for the future, but you can only ever act in the moment that we have today. So as we look through that, I just wanted to take a moment and pause, and I need to take a breath, but we are here today, and we know that our profession is incredibly important to so many of our organizations, the volunteers that we invite to join our communities, but we know things are continuously changing, and it's a great place to stop and pause and say, there's a rich history of humanity, a rich history of volunteer engagement and volunteerism that we can draw on and continue to learn from, but we're also moving forward. And what is today's conflicting pressures, priorities, and engagement that we have? And how can we continue to look to other understandings of volunteerism and care for the community? So when we look back to the First Nations values and the care for all that they bring to their nation, how do we incorporate that into our understanding of volunteering? Or when we look at backgrounds like the African belief of Ubuntu and the I am for we are, and the value that comes from understanding how other people carried the value of caring for one another through their histories and their engagements. And again, there's so much we can learn from so many values that we have here. And we stop in this moment and we say, what can we do with our moment that we have today? And I really do think this idea of moving out of hierarchy into collaboration is such it's a buzzword in so many ways, but it is such an important part of moving into knowing and understanding how to lead volunteers, how to be a part of communities, depending on what our volunteer management role is. There's a large place for us to say, how can I best be helping my community to all have a value, all have a say, to allow people to volunteer in ways that are healthy and that are advancing community care and kindness in our presence. So there's so much to reflect on in the moment. That critical question that we move forward into, that we could think and take time and have debates and measure, is how can we evolve our role in the advancing not-for-profit sector? How do we decentralize the power in our communities, allowing freedom and human care to flourish together and have people choose to give towards their communities in a variety of ways and do that with excellence? And I think that piece is something that we can continuously place. And I think, to me, we could spend a lot of time learning from the past, but really anticipating moving into that. And then the future question that I pose, and again, we can take time and it's an abstract place, is how do we ensure that the volunteerism that we understand meets the needs of the communities today? And as new and present needs are being felt and heard, that we listen and that we adapt and we change, and that we continue to be that force for good and champions of a society that cares, that society that builds towards making more possibilities and values true. So a lot to reflect on and think about, but I think the past, the retrospect, is something that there's so much we can gain and add from the times that the people and the efforts and the careers of the people that have given in the past, that sometimes go unnoticed, because again, so many leaders of volunteers are so busy in the doing, in the working, and so many of these volunteer presentations I find are about the doing better, or the doing more efficiently, or the new tools for doing. And we needed to just maybe take one of these sessions to reflect back and be able to say, there are some really interesting things worth going back and reflecting on and seeing. And so I ask you to look at the resources that are there. If there are particular parts that are interesting, I'll just briefly go through just some of the slides here. So I have a number of those resources all ready to kind of explore it. And again, I'll share the slide deck to engage. But I do think, as a collective, taking time to reflect and to find a retrospect is really, truly something that we don't do often enough. And I certainly hadn't before I took on this challenging, different role, but for a workshop. But I do hope you learned something, you remembered something, or something piqued your interest or curiosity as we went through. So happy to pause there and give people a chance to either share or think about something along their history of volunteer management that stuck with them, that they might bring into retrospect for us today too.
Thank you so much, Adam. I have a sense that there are sentiments developing out there that match the ones that I can read in the chat room right now. This has been a set of historical signposts I think everybody can find value in, and all against an axiological backdrop, if you will, focused on values, as you say. And that's a really tough issue to get one's head around, because I don't think many people spend time considering the nature of their own values to the extent that would be helpful with a subject like this one, or any subject for that matter. I'm learning that about myself recently, and I find the advice very, very well timed. And this has been inspiring. You've successfully deployed substantive signposts, like I indicated, like Margaret Mead and Susan Ellis. And this is something that would probably serve as a great orientation for those who lead volunteers. Any questions out there? Adam comes back to us in a month, at which time he will probably build on this and explore different aspects, or even respond to questions that can come up between now and then. Hi, Lynn, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I put a candy in my mouth as he was wrapping up, so we're going to talk kind of funny. Well, I want to say, yeah, I really enjoyed that. I love this way of thinking. I mean, I think it's great for us to take responsibility for our history like that. I have a comment and a question. One was when you talked about, moving from a hierarchy and colonialism into a more collaborative approach, that really resonates with me, because I keep walking around saying partners, they're partners, and their tendency to either make volunteers heroes or slaves, and that we need to be partners. And I think, I don't know, I just think the reason I'm thinking that way is because the world is thinking that way. And so instead of being behind, we need to be moving ahead and dragging everyone with us. So that you really, I think there's a lot here. Like, I think there's a lot to unpack. So which led to my next question, which is, how did you go about coming up with this? Like, when you talk about going to sources, and has this been running in your brain like for the last 20 years, or what was your strategy, you know, for finding information?
Yeah, 100%. So part of it is a catalyst that Dean posed, trying something different in a workshop webinar. We were talking, we were almost about to go into the philosophy of volunteering, which is not my strong suit at all, but somebody should do that. But the history of volunteering, and I come from a background where studying things in historical context was a big part of my early career. This admittedly, again, as a sliver, as an ability to just say there's so much back there to look for. And I just wanted to hit some highlights of key moments and key pieces of evidence. One of my pet peeves is somebody's like focusing on this topic like it's never been discussed before. And then you go back and you're like, actually, there's dozens of people who have really spent time and energy and effort really hashing out some of the finer points of this. We need to learn from others that have gone before, and there's so much value there. They need to be understood in their historical context, but there's still a value of the work that they were doing and the problems they were trying to solve in the time that they were solving them. And again, I think stumbling into the Ellis archives, I think a number of years ago now, when I have time or an excuse to go and delve, I have such a curiosity about understanding why are we the way we are today? Why is this profession where it's at? And so that curiosity really drove the resources and the research. And again, I admit this, if I handed this into a professor, I wouldn't be expecting an A+. I'm just expecting the, interesting and valid materials that can be resourced and further experienced. I would love to carry this into a more formal engagement with people to codify and further engage our history. Again, not a historian, I'm a practical practitioner of volunteer management who just loves and respects the past and wants to really reinvest in that era.
Yeah.
And I think the last piece to that is I think COVID got in the way of a lot of the great work that was being done before with volunteer management. And some of these stories and histories were disrupted, and hopefully not permanently, and not our focus is just like there was volunteer management and COVID, and now we're where we are. There was such a depth and a richness to everything that was happening previous. So.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. Thanks for your work. I think you've got the bones for a book there.
Shannon has included a really neat comment, and when we review Shannon's comment, I'll go to Shannon in a moment here. It made me think of Alexis de Tocqueville, who he came over to North America, he traveled through the United States and Canada in the wake of the French Revolution, and wrote his book, Democracy in America, in 1831. And while he may not have used the term volunteers, his focus was all on associations, exactly like the ones that Shannon has identified. And I'll go to Shannon now to help share her question and comment.
And you just reminded me, and it's been a while since I read it, but I also remember a book about the development of the Katimavik program. Does anybody remember Katimavik?
Yeah, Katimavik, yeah.
Yes, yep.
Yeah, so just thinking, because there were some significant people involved in leading that, I think even Justin Trudeau at the end for a little bit. I just also wanted to highlight your comment, Adam. I think there's a lot of fodder for a book here around how some of the most complex and fragile work, the right word isn't coming to me, but some of the most complicated and challenging work is done by volunteers. And I'm also thinking of the health sector, and how in the VON and its origins, although nurses may have been paid, they weren't necessarily paid for all their traveling hours and time to get to points and posts remotely. Volunteers, the firefighting example, and that continues, and people who volunteer as first responders in difficult situations now. So there's a lot of scope for thinking about the danger and risk involved in volunteering over the years.
Thank you, Shannon.
Beautiful.
Adam, would you like to respond before we go to Heather Johnson?
Just that you're validating that this is, again, just a sliver of all the great depth of volunteering. And I think one of the things you're saying too is because volunteering is done by individuals who aren't in it for their namesake, sometimes you don't get that large scale like picture of a person volunteering, but the impact is distributed through a collective, right? And so it's harder to peg it as so and so made such a great impact because society often finds ways to. I was just reading about Robin Hood, and Robin Hood never existed, but the term Robin Hood came from multiple people who are doing the same activity. So we don't have a Robin Hood of volunteering who's a person, a human who, isn't really a human, but kind of exemplifies all the different volunteering that was done in various eras. So it definitely is something that maybe because of the nature of humility and giving of oneself, it's harder to peg people historically in that sense and find that, in all of those, like I'm sure there's a nurse that could, an archetype of a nurse who gave all their time traveling as a volunteer that you could personify, but maybe we haven't been able to successfully do that, which maybe is another interesting way to help highlight and empower the volunteering that's been done along the way.
Cameron has made some suggestions there for other resources to consider. His remarks can be seen in the chat, and I acknowledge Heather Johnson, the president of Pavro, has her hand up. We welcome her participation.
Thanks, Dean. And Adam, amazing presentation. It's so interesting to see the history, and just as a reminder for all of us, because we work in our individual sectors, that sometimes we forget that there's a larger collective and that there's a larger history there. And I was reminded, just thinking about, to build on what Shannon said, what we would notice really quickly, I think, if people didn't volunteer. Regardless of our role as helping to bring those people together and all the things that we do, I think society would screech to a halt really quickly if people didn't give their time in all the ways that they do. But my question to you, Adam, is just building on, as you were pulling this together, was there anything that in your research that really surprised you? Things that you kind of went, oh, like that we didn't know as you were pulling this together. It's because it's quite, as you say, it is a sliver, it is a really important one for all of us, but we'd love to know sort of some of your aha moments as you were diving into this. And thank you so much for the resources. I am all about resources. I think if I wasn't a volunteer engagement person, I'd be a historian, but yeah. This is cool.
Very much see the same thing, and especially after doing this, how much like untapped engagement and value is in there. That graphic that, and I don't want to share actually, I'm going to stop sharing just because it's easier to chat. I didn't realize that was still on. But the graphic of like the impact of a successful volunteer coordinator and a strong volunteer program, that graphic is things that I've been contemplating the past number of years and trying to create a equation almost of the value promise. And I'm like, then I go find something from 1970 that's 2 steps ahead of where I'd gotten in all my work. So those sorts of things, I think that's the biggest aha, is this just, so many people come to the profession and start right away. It's not like they spend 4 years preparing to become a volunteer manager, where if you were taking history or you're taking English or you're taking all these other bachelor programs, you do spend so much time learning how did this become the thing that it is. And it's that argument of saying, do you need more in-depth programs? I didn't attend the college programs, but I know that they're very practical and more on the practice of volunteer management. So that was the piece, is that there's just so much work that's been done that if we knew it, we would probably be not redoing it so often and kind of stumbling over what we think are things that haven't been tackled yet, or that there aren't resources out there for, because they're there. They're just hard to find, and you need to take the time to go and really delve into them. So.
Cool. So it sounds like after you get your book written, we're going to inaugurate you as the first professor of volunteer history, right?
Yeah, no. I might find a collective, as we say, collaborative, right? So, and happy that if there is interest to continue these conversations in some way, shape, or form, it's in some ways it feels light because it's not directly related to our mechanics of building and growing volunteer programs, but in other ways, yeah, it is you have to care about it and be passionate about it to want to delve. But if there is interest, by all means, reach out. And I want to continue kind of at least making some access points to what's there. And the NPC, for example, has some great resources, but they're so dense that it's hard to access them. So maybe it's creating something that makes some of this history and some of the pieces that are valuable a little more attainable for very busy leaders and volunteers. So
I was inspired by aspects of your presentation, Adam. It reminded me, I've got this book on the shelf at home, The Origin of Ranks, and it makes me think about how volunteers are treated in organizations and what their motivations might be. And I recognize in some of the work I'm doing towards obtaining the CVA that it's important how you establish the relationship between the staff and the volunteers themselves. So how are they fitting into the framework? How are they treated? And I'm inspired to go look at that book to see if I can find some parallels that might help us. And what reminds me about this, of course, is the work of Immanuel Kant, who did a whole lot of great work on the pure reason, practical reason, judgment. But some of the hardest things that he tried to work on were morality or morals. And he, through the categorical imperative, stressed how important it is that we don't use people as means to an end. You have to treat people with the full respect, in other words, that they are the ends in and of themselves. And that's an important way to approach this particular subject. I think with a comment from Faiza, that might be the end of our presentation. She is recommending a book by the CCVA's founding executive director, Katie Campbell, and I encourage everybody to consider or consult Faiza's remark there. And Victoria speaking about Nightingale nurses. With that, I'd just like to offer my sincere thanks for a job very well done, Adam, and pass on the final word to our president, Heather Johnson, please.
Thank you, Dean. Adam, again, thank you so much. What an amazing presentation. Looking forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you to everyone for being here today. As Dean mentioned, we'll be welcoming Adam back next month. And also wishing Adam and everyone every success who's going on to the VMPC conference at the beginning of May. And then hopefully you will, if you can, you'll join us the following week for the Pavro conference, which will be in Collingwood. So again, thank you everyone for being here today. And have a fantastic rest of your afternoon. And we'll look forward to seeing you at the next webinar in April, which will also feature Adam. I believe he's popped his information into the chat, or it'll be with the slide deck so that we can all continue this fantastic conversation with him. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Bye now.
Thanks, Adam.
All the best.